Well, good morning, everybody. We get started with our Government Operations and Fiscal Policy Committee. We do have 3 items this morning. Our first one is the spending affordability guidelines for the FY21 operating budget. And we do have Mr. Mullen here from the Office of Management and Budget. And of course, we have Gene Smith, who has prepared this packet, and it's one of our legislative analysts who covers these issues. I did see here that Mr. Platt was also listed. I don't know if he's coming, but if he does, we'll welcome him to the table. And I will turn it over to you, Mr. Smith, to walk us through our decision points and your recommendations.
Certainly. So the council must set spending affordability guidelines for the operating budget every year by the second Tuesday of February. So as always, council staff has prepared options and recommendations for the committee's consideration today. Just a little bit of background. Seems to be the theme for the millions watching at home.
Right, exactly.
The county charter does require that the county council set by law how it's going to establish guidelines for both the capital and operating budget. The council has done that, and the county code for the operating budget requires that the GO committee make recommendations on 3 items today: setting the ceiling for the ad valorem real property tax, setting the aggregate or the ceiling for the aggregate operating budget, and then allocating that operating budget to certain portions of the budget. The county code does not specify how those guidelines get set, but it does state that the committee and the council should consider certain economic conditions, economic activity, et cetera. Council staff on pages 2 to 4 has provided a bulleted list of certain data points that I believe are relevant to this conversation. I'll highlight just a few real quick. Overall, the county continues to be in a good position with steady growth, particularly in the household income range. And also just with favorable economic conditions, though we did hear during the December fiscal plan update that the county's revenues are in fluctuation mostly due to inflation, which is another point. Inflation is much lower than we were expecting a year ago, primarily due to the Federal Reserve lowering inflation rate or lowering the interest rates 3 times last year. The Department of Finance continues to estimate our resident employment growing at about 1% a year, but that's about 4,000 to 5,000 resident employment jobs, so to speak, per year. So 1% may seem low, but it's not a small number given our overall size of the county. And then finally, unemployment in the county and the region as a whole is historically low and low compared to the national average. So those are some of the highlights that are in the economic conditions in pages 2 to 4. There's more there if you wish to look at them, and we can talk about them later as we go through the next steps. So the council staff will quickly go through the 3. We'll go by step in terms of the options the committee needs to recommend for the council. The first recommendation that the committee needs to take up is the setting the ceiling for real property tax revenues for next year. What we've always done and continue to do is set that at charter limit, which is what the section 305 of the charter says, that based on fiscal 20 revenues times the inflation rate. That does not determine or predetermine how the council will set the actual rate and tax credits that are related to that during the budget process. As always, we will continue to do that during the budget deliberations. Council staff, again, this year recommends setting it at the charter limit.
Okay, are there any questions regarding that particular recommendation? Without objection, we will adopt that.
Very good. So for the ceiling of the aggregate operating budget, the second decision the committee needs to make, I want to make a couple quick notes. Again, the recommendation decision that the council will make on this ceiling only sets the 7-vote threshold for the budget deliberations in May and June. It does not predetermine the total budget that will get set. It just says that anything above the ceiling that is recommended and then set by council in February requires 7 votes in June. Council staff on Circle 5 has provided 4 options for the public and for the committee's consideration. The first option is a 0% increase over the fiscal 20 aggregate operating budgets, a no growth scenario. Option 2 represents a 0.86% decrease from the fiscal 20 aggregate operating budget, and this is primarily due to the fiscal plan that was presented to us in December showing a 7% reduction in both the county government and park and planning. The third option is a 1.27% increase, which is the inflation rate for 2019, and then the fourth option is a 2.35% increase, which was the household income growth rate that finance estimated for 2019. Council staff also on page 5 notes how the council has set this rate over the last decade. Again, there's no requirement how it gets set. There's a lot of different ways that we calculate it and reasons why previous councils made their decisions. For this year, council staff recommends going with option 3, which is based on the inflation rate. Even though that we have a stable economy and good growth, given the revenue outlook that we got in December, I believe a little bit of restraint just setting the aggregate operating budget ceiling makes sense for the February decision, and then as we get to March and we see the recommended budget from the executive, the council can make its deliberations from there. So again, I recommend option number 3, which is a 1.27% increase over the fiscal 20 aggregate operating budget.
Okay. Any questions from my colleagues? So without objection, we'll adopt that recommendation.
Very good. The third step, or kind of third decision points that the committee needs to make today is allocating that aggregate operating budget to various specific agencies or non-agency budgets. There's some that are listed in the county code. I'm just going to note that setting these limits or setting these allocations now has zero ramification for the council's decisions in the March to June timeframe. The council will go through all of the puts and takes it does in that time frame. The actual requirement, what it does set up is that the agencies that exceed that from the executive's recommended operating budget will need to send a memo to the council detailing what reductions they will take and how that will affect programs. Again, this is just allocating the AOB or the aggregate operating budget to specific things. I'll go quickly through them and I'll stop at each point and let the committee either thumbs up or thumbs down those recommendations. So for debt service, council staff recommends setting it based on the fiscal 21 projection, which is what was in the fiscal plan update, and it is, in terms of numbers, $442.2 million.
Are we okay with that?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
All right. And then there's current revenue, which also includes PAYGO. This is again set at the fiscal plan update in December of 2019, which is $86.5 million. And $32 million for PAYGO. Okay.
Okay.
The next item is OPEB, or the retiree health insurance pre-funding. Again, that's set at the actuarial expectation for fiscal 21, which is $127.7 million.
All right, without objection.
For MCPS, the council staff recommends setting at the fiscal 21 MOE projection that was in the December fiscal plan update, which is $2.5156 billion.
Any questions? Without objection, we will adopt that.
Great. For Montgomery College, staff recommends using the fiscal plan update MOE. And one quick note, it has a $4.4 million reduction. This is not a reduction in MOE or appropriation. It's a reduction based on the expectation that we use the entire fund balance that we appropriated in fiscal 20. Certainly if they have additional fund balance that we let them appropriate in fiscal 21, that number will look different. So again, that's what staff recommends is $186.5 million.
Okay. All right. Without
And-
objection, we're good.
Very good. And then for the county government and park and planning, as always, the remaining resources get allocated based on their portion in the fiscal 20 budget. For the county government, the total would be $1,561.2 million.
All right.
And then for park and planning, it'll be $128.6 million.
Okay, without objection. Okay.
Very good. That concludes all the decisions the committee needs to make, or recommendations they need to make. One final note, in previous years, the council grants manager, or the staff for that, had recommended a line item in the resolution that included a level funding and a 50-50 split between the executive and council community grants. Based on my understanding from the council staff handling that, she recommended that that not need to be included in the resolution this year, so that currently is not included in the resolution.
Yes, because we're going through a whole process of reforming all of that.
So,
Okay.
very good.
Awesome.
Very good.
All right, thank you. So we're done with item number 1. Very good. Moving right along, item number 2 is to discuss proposed items and recommended plan to the council regarding the economic development platform. As we all know, the council adopted an economic development platform resolution on November 19th. And stated in the action portion of that resolution was that committees would work to develop action plans that should be finished by February 11th. The platform contains 4 quadrants: transportation, workforce development. It includes housing as well as business attraction, retention, and expansion. It is really, more importantly, to serve as a framework for the council and the executive to be able to address a lot of the shared interest regarding economic development and how can we move forward with a strategic framework. After so many conversations that all of us have had, especially with our private sector and our business partners, one particular observation kept coming up, which was, okay, what exactly is the strategic vision? Because we have done a lot of work, in my opinion, in the past to set up the county to take advantage of all of its assets and understanding what are some of those elements that continue to be really pivotal for economic development, such as transportation and workforce development and issues of housing, and also a lot of feedback around business, ability to operate here in the county, to maintain and to expand. And so this is a framework to hopefully focus us on what are the great things that we have put in place, and also what are some of those gaps or opportunities that we should begin to work on immediately. It's my understanding that Council President Katz is going to circle back with other folks to ensure that all of us are in our committees are working towards this. So this is our first crack at this at the GO committee. Obviously, there's always room to figure out and tweak things, but again, it's an opportunity to kind of focus our work so that we can then come back and look back and see how we're hitting our targets. So I really do appreciate Mr. Gene Smith for working on this and bringing forth some recommendations for our committee to discuss and then present to the full council. Councilmember Friedson.
Well, thank you. I think this is a really great start to deliberative process and to working on and focusing on economic development and fulfilling the platform that we set forward as a council and within each of the committee's work programs as we committed to do, and which you have focused us on. I think, Mr. Smith, your recommendations here I think are really good and I think are a really important start. The Business Hub program, I had a lot to say on that during last year's budget process, largely the question I think that we're going to be asking here and hopefully answering, which is how does this fit into a broader strategy of supporting our small businesses? I don't think that was had been fully fleshed out as much as it could be, and I think this will be a really good opportunity to do what we couldn't really do then, as we were in the midst of a budget, which I'm excited for. And I think the subdivision staging policy is critical to so much of what we do here in terms of this question of growth. And I think we need to have a big question about growth. I think too often we talk about growth in the context of what do we have now in terms of infrastructure and what will that allow us to appropriately grow. And I think the better question, the one that we should be asking in the context of economic development, is what kind of growth do we need economically and in our communities in order to achieve our goals in terms of quality of life, in terms of level of services, in terms of taking care of the people who need help. And then what type of infrastructure do we need to invest in to make sure that that growth can be handled appropriately? I think we need to flip that upside down, and I think this will be an opportunity to really do that, where we talk, we start with the question of growth not as how do we stop it, but how do we get to where we need to go and how much do we need, and then how do we get there, and then plan accordingly and fulfill our commitments to get there. So I think that will be really helpful as well. And I'm really excited about the tax questions and the tax credit analysis. I asked for a similar review in the Fed committee on economic development funds and all the different programs. And Mr. Smith, you've been really helpful in that regard as well. And I think this will be similar to that. And I think this is a really great opportunity for us to look inward and figure out what are we doing and is it accomplishing our goals, and are we achieving what we would hope to achieve? And if not, how do we repurpose these funds to make sure that they're helping to spur the economic activity and the regional competitiveness that we all aspire to have. So I am looking forward to this conversation. I'm looking forward to these different aspects of the economic development platform both in the near months and in the up and coming years. And I think we've broken it down in an appropriate way to be able to tackle it with the level of seriousness and substantive nature that it requires. So thank you.
Thank you. Council President Katz.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I too agree that these are very good recommendations. You know, the whole idea of infrastructure, many times what government has done is that we come up with a plan and we let one side go forward and we don't keep up with our side. And that's what's happened with infrastructure in so many, many ways. And part of it is we never have enough money, and you always have a lot more need than you have the money. And that, I understand that. But we need to make certain that our blueprint, which is what this really should be, for a platform, that the blueprint has a timeline in it that we need to, as best we can, stick to it. And, you know, there's always something that happens that you have to consider doing something else before it works. I mean, you can't think of everything when you're doing a blueprint, but I do believe that that's part of our concern. And what we need to do, we need for our growth, so that while we are growing, we're not taking away from the quality of life from what we have. So I think these are very, very good recommendations, great suggestions, and I think we need to be moving forward with keeping that in mind.
All right, Mr. Smith, can you go over the recommendations?
Sure. As the co-chair said, she requested that staff prepare some recommendations for the committee to consider to send to the council in response to the economic development platform deadline. The council staff used 12 months and 13 to 24 months. You could also exchange those for short-term versus long-term, depending on what the committee prefers in terms of lexicon. So for the shorter term, as Mr. Friedson noted, the Business Hub program was created in fiscal 20 by Mr. Elrich. We haven't received much information regarding that, and it would be a good time to check in and see how that program is connecting with our businesses, how it's serving our businesses. I know they're out there working in the regional service centers. And staff has recommended that in conjunction with the fiscal 21 budget, but they based on the committee's desire, that could always be scheduled before the budget or based on timing. The second item.
Mr. Smith, the only one point that I would add to that particular recommendation, when we have that briefing, it would be also critical to know how the Small Business Impact Program has worked, what has been the results, as this is really was pretty much like an experiment in Wheaton, but obviously there will be other instances. So if we could also incorporate that in that briefing, that would be great.
Certainly.
Council President Katz.
And just on that same point, obviously we're beginning that whole process. The hubs have just started. I mean, I don't know that there's one in Germantown as well that's now being started, and I think another one is being started somewhere else, Silver Spring, I think. I think that's right. But anyhow, so we need to give it time in order for it to figure out what is and what isn't working. But we also need to make certain that we watch over it while we are looking into it to see what is and what isn't working.
I do want to recognize Mr. Bob Buchanan and appreciate his input as we have been working on this economic development platform. I think that he has been a really important voice, and as we said earlier, I did text my staff and said, I think Mr. Buchanan was here, but then he left. He probably went to the 7th floor because we were supposed to be in the, anyway, long story short, I just, just wanted to acknowledge and thank you. This is our commitment, obviously, to follow through what the action portion of the resolution stated, which was for committees to begin to work and identify some areas. This is not an exhaustive list, but I think it's, the beginning, and Mr. Gene Smith has prepared, I think, a really good starting point, and other committees will be doing the same. But I just really wanted to acknowledge and thank you.
Thank you. It's very nice to be a part of something that really needs to be focused front and center, and I think you were very good as then Council President to bring a lot of us together to see what was viable and the sense of urgency. I'm actually about to testify on the bus transformation project, which I think is also an economic imperative if we're going to have the housing needs met and the nature of clusters of mix of uses that will add to our economic platform. a revitalized and transformed transit system, I think, is also a priority.
Yes, yes. So,
But thank you
so
for
we're busy
recognizing
at
me.
work. Thank you. Mr. Smith.
Sure. And I'm remiss to say that certainly council members should wordsmith whatever they want, so I will include the small business assistance program that is,
Gene Smith. Oh, that's good.
it's a Wednesday or Thursday.
Okay.
Anyway, and again,
We're here all day. We probably won't be.
And council staff will formalize this for review by the committee before it gets sent to the council, but by all means, please.
Excellent.
The second point was for the near term, as Mr. Friedson already noted, the subdivision staging policy will be sent over by Park and Planning this year. Impact taxes are a large part of that conversation in terms of where areas are cordoned off, what types of rates we have, and we have several exemptions that are included in that, and so having a review of that before the GO committee sometime this summer would make sense, but we'll have to see as we go into that process. That's a good time because that obviously will impact where infrastructure is not only funded, but also where development can occur, what kind of development we council would want to occur. And so that would be the short-term items. Are there any other short-term items that the committee members wish to add to this list?
Not necessarily, but obviously when we do take on the subdivision staging policy review, let's make sure that we are aligning some of our work also with the Fed committee in terms of some of the conversations that they may be having, so that we're not operating in silos. I think that would be my only observation. Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you. The only thing that I would add, this is a really good analysis of what we are doing, but I think it might be helpful to look at tax policies that some other jurisdictions are doing and review them for their applicability to Montgomery County. I think it would be helpful to have a few examples of other things that are working in other places and see if perhaps they are things that we ought to consider in terms of tax credits or other types of tax policy mechanisms to spur economic activity and economic growth, particularly in areas that are important, like the Purple Line corridor, along in transit areas, et cetera.
Excellent. Great.
Very
All
good.
right.
And then I was going to say the other two items are more on the longer term, knowing that the committee is busy doing a lot of great work, and this is additional work that we'll be taking on. So we've already noted, and Mr. Friesen just noted, staff was just recommending, and we don't have a timeline for this yet, but looking at the larger the taxes kind of systematically, what the council has when they levy them, how that impacts economic development as well as tax credits. And so that work will need to be fleshed out as we proceed through this year in terms of an actual long-term not action plan, but schedule. And then the second item is related to the third item you guys are going to consider today. How does the council use procurement and procurement law to enable businesses to not only produce goods and services and get opportunities to grow here in the county, but maybe grow beyond regionally as they grow here. So those are the two items that are a longer-term review for the GO committee. And then the final item that the committee will show for the council will be just, obviously, as items come up, you will schedule them that may not be on this action plan.
One of the pieces, following up on what Councilmember Friedson said, as we are going to, check in to see how the community engagement cluster business hub model is working. I think I would say this is like short to long term, but it would be important also, I think, for the Government Operations Committee to understand how other jurisdictions have structured government operations to support economic development. And so what are some of the models that seem to be very innovative that, allow for businesses or for folks who are entrepreneurs to access information or, access funds, so more looking at how are we positioning county government to best respond. So we've done some work already, and I think this administration has taken, a different, view, if you will, with some of the ways it has realigned some of its operations. But I think this is obviously something that we take a little time, but that's another feedback piece that we always hear. And given that this is government operations, that, it'd be nice to figure out if there are some things that we can improve. Council President Katz.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say that I actually like the terms for the 12 months versus saying short-term and 13 to 24 months rather than long-term. Because you use the term short-term and long-term, and to somebody, short-term can be 18 months, 2 years. I think we need to keep our feet to the fire.
Very good. And following up also with what the GEO chair just said, we'll add a third bullet, either to the short or to the 12 months or 13 plus months. But for the structure, I believe that's a separate item, and so that will be included. And as council staff said, I'll draft something, present it to the committee before you guys send it to the council.
Perfect. All right. Look, I think we're the first committee that did our homework. Yay. Yay, go. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Smith. Item number 3. And let's see here. I believe that Ms. Wellens is staffing this. Wasn't sure if Mr. Smith was also staffing this item since he seems to really love GEO.
Yeah.
Appreciate and welcome Ms. Wellens who put this packet together. I know Mr. Shetty is here, Procurement Director, if you can come forward, and anybody else that you invited today. This bill, 39-19, Contracts and Procurement, Local Small Business Reserve Program, LSBRP amendments, is sponsored by lead sponsor Councilmember Jawando and co-sponsors Rice, Navarro, Reamer, Albornoz, Glass, and Council Vice President Hucker and Council President Katz. It was introduced on December 3rd of 2019, and we held a public hearing on January 14th. This bill would amend the Small Business Reserve Program to permit the participation of nonprofit organizations in the program, increase the minimum percentage of contracts that must be awarded to small businesses, and establish a goal to award certain direct purchases to local small businesses and alter reporting requirements. All right, Ms. Wellen, anything you want to, if you can walk us through the packet, and then Mr. Shetty, also please, any observation or anything like that as well, just jump right in.
Thank you, Madam Chair and council members. Good morning.
morning.
So as the chair mentioned, this bill would do make several alterations to the local small business reserve program. Just briefly, I wanted to point out as a backdrop to the bill that as the committee knows, there was an in-depth Office of Legislative Oversight report that came out in July 2019 regarding the Small Business Reserve Program that recommended, among other things, adopting strategies to increase the number of participating local small businesses. One of the examples they included was prioritizing awards that are under $10,000, so the small procurements, the direct purchases. So in line with that, this bill does prioritize small direct purchases, sets a 50% goal for the using agencies to award at least 50% of their small procurements or their direct purchases to certified small businesses. It also increases, as the chair said, increases the 20% goal that we have in place for awarding eligible procurements to 20% of those to certified small businesses, increases it to 25%. The bill also would permit nonprofit organizations who meet the criteria to participate in the small business program. And the bill would increase transparency by requiring using departments to report to the Office of Procurement in greater detail regarding direct purchases. The only other thing I wanted to mention before any questions or comments by Mr. Shetty would be that in the staff memorandum to you on pages 4 and 5, there are a couple of important technical amendments that staff is recommending based upon comments that we received by the comments and questions from the county attorney's office. One of the clarifying amendments would be to make sure that the definition of direct purchase under the law is aligning with the definition that we already have in place under county regulations. And you can see that definition spelled out on page 5. It's an informal procurement of construction goods or services with the total value of no more than $10,000. And then the other clarification was that the county attorney's office wasn't sure, as the bill that was originally drafted, whether direct purchases that are going to that 50% goal for having 50% of the direct purchases to small businesses can also count towards the 25% goal. And in keeping with the sponsor's intent, this amendment would, or I should let the sponsor speak for himself, but this amendment would clarify that yes, an agency could say this is meeting our 50% goal, but it's also going to our 25% goal. So that's the purpose of the second amendment. And that's it. Then the issue before the committee is whether to recommend approval of the bill to the full council. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Shetty, any comments do you have?
Good morning.
Morning.
I was told that there may be some questions about the inclusion of nonprofits and whether this in any way adversely affects for-profit organizations, and I thought I'd just give you some information on that. It is somewhat subjective, to be very honest with you. The chamber, I believe their concerns, or the chamber's concerns, were the fact that nonprofits get grants and then they use that money, which allows them to have a lower cost basis, but frankly, their tax structure also allows them that. Very honestly, I don't believe ever waive the prevailing wage laws for profits, but we will on occasion waive them for nonprofits. So there's many reasons why you could argue that nonprofits, have this advantage. I think that if we saw that they were competing with for-profits, we'd probably be less likely to waive their prevailing wage laws in those cases, because that would definitely be us tipping the scales. But that's all information I think that, it's worth putting out there, because it supports what the chamber's concerns would be for also including nonprofits in this. But what I would also add, and this is something to weigh sort of the counterweight, is that very often we find ourselves in scenarios where there is not enough of a local pool because of our inability to include nonprofits in the delivery of a service or the ability to provide a service. Mm-hmm. And in that case, what we end up doing, and I actually pulled the numbers on this, there were actually 15 instances in 2019 and 18 instances in half of FY20 where we actually threw it out of LSBRP. So now not only did they have the nonprofits compete with them, they also had every other large entity from within and outside the jurisdiction competing with those for-profits now. I suspect in many cases a nonprofit ultimately won it anyway. I don't have that data, unfortunately, but my point is that there are also advantages to allowing nonprofits here, which is basically that it still stays local, because otherwise when we don't have enough of a pool, because nonprofits don't count as being part of that, you end up having nonprofits come in anyway along with a whole lot of other folks that defeats the purpose of LSBRP entirely.
Got it. All right. So you are in favor?
I am. Yes. And frankly, there's not a whole lot that I can say here, because when Councilmember Giovando initially started working on this bill, he actually worked very closely with us. I mean, Grace and his staff interacted so many times that it's hard to keep track anymore.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you for that. I think I'm glad you raised the question. I think it's a legitimate concern that was raised by the chamber. I'm inclined to agree, however, that nonprofits are employers, and they have a huge role in our county. Actually, some of the largest employers in the county are nonprofits, and I see them as part of the business community, because I see that as in the employer community. They're providing jobs and livelihoods, and that's really important for us. And I think when it comes to procurement, it really is about competitiveness. And the question is, are we getting as much bang for our limited taxpayer dollars for the services that we need? And I think we should be doing as much as we can, and obviously where we can, providing as much residual benefit back to the community on the spending that we're making. And so I think that's first should be competitiveness, second should be where we can, where appropriate, making sure that it's providing an additional benefit for the dollars that we're spending. I did have a quick question. You raised in the packet notes this question of about 30,000 small businesses in Montgomery County, 1,067 small businesses registered with the program, and you raised the question of part of the goal here is to have more eligible organizations to make the process more competitive, which at least theoretically should either get us a better service or a cheaper cost for the procurements that we're doing, at least in theory. Could you speak to the number of small businesses? Is it that there are a lot of the small businesses aren't eligible for a number of reasons, or is it that they're not applying? Because I see those as two different problems. There could be an issue that not enough of our small businesses are aware of the program or taking advantage of it. They don't see that it's a benefit. I mean, I see, to me, I read that quite differently. I read that as if there's 30,000 small businesses that might be eligible and only 1,067 of them that have gone through the process to become eligible, that perhaps we have a broader problem with the program that needs to be solved, and that this bill, while helpful, would not necessarily solve that problem. So could you just speak to that for a moment?
Sure. So there's so many things packed into that issue that it's a relatively long conversation to have, but I'll try to touch on some of the main points. First and foremost, something that you hinted at, this idea that our local small business requires you to be both local with a very specific definition of what local is, that is more than 50% of your employees are based in your Montgomery County location, or more than 50% of your revenues are attributed to employees based in your Montgomery County based location. And we've had discussions about that in the past, but the basic idea is that would also limit what you would consider now a local organization versus like just your zip code, right? The second is the small aspect of it. And again, there's a whole scale of what makes you small, but in some cases, and I don't think this is the bigger factor, the fact that I think most of our businesses are in fact small, but there's that which automatically legally excludes certain organizations, certain companies. The other is the fact that some of these business owners may not have the interest in registering because they, for instance, own a restaurant or the type of entity which obviously is a local business, but they don't see it as being worth their while to be registered with the county because, it's not a lot of catering services that we'd be looking to do through our processes. So you've got people who they know that they could occasionally do business with us, but they're not registered as small businesses with the county. Although with this new requirement for the DPOs, for the sub $10,000 purchases, that there may be something that needs to be done there, because otherwise you wouldn't be recording those vendors who have been providing, catering for lunch meetings or things that we do, but technically we have been spending money with them, just not getting credit, for lack of a better word, for spending money with them. So there's that aspect as well, and then I'd be disingenuous if I didn't admit that then the last part of it, in terms of the major boxes to tick, is that our overall process probably comes across as not worth the hassle. Not the process of registering to be a small local, that's relatively straightforward, but after you've gotten registered, you still have to go through the entire procurement process if you're ever going to win something. And I think there's a lot of companies who've just decided that they're either too small or already doing enough business that they don't want to deal with us as a customer because the cost of admission is just too high for them, at least in terms of the bureaucracy. And I think that could also be a barrier to their registering, right? If I don't ever plan to do business with you because you're cumbersome, then I'm not going to bother even taking the first step, which is registering with you as a small business. And I think that each of those, to some extent, has some impact on that disproportionality. As far as this bill is concerned, one of my thoughts is to create a way for businesses to register that especially for the sub $10,000, which is maybe less onerous, but this way at least we can track how much of that money is going to them. Because right now the only reliable way that I can think of keeping track of those sub $10,000 DPO purchases is by looking at the zip code of the entity with whom we did business. But the problem with that is that you are sometimes going to capture large companies, so that's not necessarily local small. You're also going to capture sort of franchisees or franchises where you're not necessarily based in Montgomery County, you're based everywhere, but you happen to serve us through your Montgomery County-based location. And that's not a bad thing because, again, they're still creating jobs, they're still here. But for the sub $10,000, which is proposed in this bill, I think it makes sense for us to widen the net in terms of how we are capturing that spend, because by some estimates, right now, if you look at it, off the 73 million, it looks like only 991,000 are going to local small registered organizations. But if you take it to look at the zip codes, that number can go up to over 20 million, which is better than the sub 1 million we're looking at right now. But that is something that depending on how we count them, we might be able to
Sorry, just so I understand, that's related to the question of the principal place of business versus the zip code that is used.
Exactly. And in the case of the $10,000 P card type purchases that happen, I feel like, making sure that all your employees are based in Montgomery County and all that may be too heavy of a burden. We might want to look at a slightly broader definition of local.
I appreciate that. It's not a conversation for this particular bill, but I think since the topic is up, I do think that the 30,000 versus the 1,067 is really not a reasonable comparison. And so I think if we are going to have that comparison, it may require additional work, possibly OLO or council staff in your office. But we should figure out what are the appropriate businesses that might be eligible, that meet the size threshold, and that are in industries that we are procuring goods and services. As you noted, a restaurant and a home care, there's a dry cleaner, a tailor. I mean, there's a lot of our small businesses that are not providing services that we would ever procure. We shouldn't be judging ourselves against that because we're not targeting them to begin with. But the data that we're looking at to determine success is not relevant data. And so I think if we could find a relevant data set, it would be easier for you to judge your own office, and I think it would be easier for us to determine whether our policies are working or not working. I think in this current scenario, we're speculating, but we don't really know, and I know you're committed to that. So I just wanted to raise that. Also, I appreciate the way that you framed the issue with the small businesses versus nonprofits. I do agree with you, but I am hopeful, as you mentioned, that you'll continue to be looking at that just to make sure that we aren't, as an unintended consequence, disadvantaging any one type of organization versus another type of organization, and in all the decisions that we're making that we look at that. And then the last point that I wanted to make, the local small business reserve program is important. It's a nice program that we do, but I think the broader issue with procurement, one is what you mentioned before, is how easy it is to get a contract and to fulfill that contract. And I know you're working really hard on that, and I appreciate all the efforts that you're doing. It's part of this challenge, and the smaller business you are, the more cumbersome those onerous processes become, and the less likely you are to be able to dedicate the staff and resources to be able to fulfill the contract. But I also think that another area that really impacts small businesses isn't necessarily the dedicated fund like this and these really small contracts. It's that oftentimes we procure goods and services that are so huge that it precludes smaller organizations from being able to even compete. So they might do the work better, they might do the work more efficiently, but by the virtue of their size, they can't compete for a contract of the size and scope that we procure. And so there are lots of opportunities, and I hope that you'll continue to look at this, to break up the size of procurements, not necessarily specifically related to this specific program, but more broadly a question of how do we increase competition. One of the ways that we can do that is just as a standard course of procurement business, breaking up the contracts to make them a little bit smaller to increase the number of organizations that can necessarily compete. And I think we don't do that enough, not just in county government, but in state government and in governments across the board. And I think we ought to be looking at that. I think a good example, an easy example, is banking. The way that government banking contracts generally are set up, there is a minimum threshold for deposits, and it precludes every community bank. And that shouldn't be, because many community banks, including several that are in our county, do amazing work. We partner with them in lots of other areas, but we have necessarily precluded them from being our banking partner. And we only allow, multinational banks to be able to hold our large amount of monies, where it would be a huge benefit locally to the economy and to the county to have opportunities for other banks to compete over that money. I think there's lots of other examples. That's just one. It's the clearest and easiest, but I'm hopeful that outside the context of this bill that you'll look at that and get back to us. And with that, I want to thank you for all the work that you've done. I think there are tremendous improvements that are being made. I know Council President Katz and the county executive and you have been working hard on these issues. I think you're doing really good work. I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done. I think you and we both acknowledge that. We have to be working together. And with that, I'm happy to be added as a co-sponsor to the legislation and happy to support it along with the staff recommendations for the technical amendments. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So just to close the loop, I do believe that in our previous item, when we talked about the economic development platform, you know, Mr. Gene is here, Mr. Gene Smith, this piece needs to be incorporated into the larger conversation about procurement. I know Ms. Deno probably has a lot of memories of this exact conversation in this committee in terms of how do we open up those opportunities through either, you know, breaking contracts. We talked about some of the bundling that happens, some of the, you know, mentor protege programs that we need to look at. So hopefully we can do a review of some of the items that have been discussed in the past. Where are we? And then where are some of those other opportunities? Very good point that Councilmember Friedson made regarding this, because it is pretty much part of then for government operations, what it is that we can set through our own county government to then promote economic development, because it's all about access. So it's very important. Council President Katz.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Ash and Grace. You truly do a marvelous job. You sincerely do. I did want to point out that we use the term small contracts, and you say $10,000. Well, to a small business, $10,000 is a very good day. I mean, you know, so this could literally keep somebody in business until they can get into the next step of their growth. So I think this really does a very good job. And to Councilmember Friedson's point about the banking and that sort of thing, and we have had those conversations offline with various departments, but I really believe that's something else we need to consider. The more that we can, and of course, when we use the term small bank, smaller banks, they get bought out every day, it seems. I mean, if they're a smaller bank, they're not a smaller bank for long. But I do think we should do that, and I do like the idea, as the committee chair mentioned, about breaking some of, and Councilmember Friedson too, about breaking some of the larger contracts into smaller ones. I think that does keep some people out of the possibility for bidding on it. But I do think that if we could do that, we would be even more competitive, have more businesses that want to be here. And we always talk about our competitive counties, the counties that we are competing against, and they play that if you have a business there that you get preference and all that, and I really believe that that's what we need to do as well. So I think this is a good. It's more than a first step, but this is a very good step for what we're trying to do.
All right, so I think what I'm hearing is that we are prepared to approve this bill as amended and then report that to the full council. Thank you, everybody. And that completes our GO session. Thank you so much. We're adjourned.